Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining. I feel delighted to welcome all of you to the first session of the second edition of a series of lectures which started in the year 2016. I feel delighted to welcome today's speaker, Professor Dr. Jaydeep Sarangi. I also feel glad and happy to welcome Sardar R.S. Chahal, President, Guru Nanak College. I feel humbled to welcome Professor P. Shekhar, who has been the principal of Guru Nanak College for more than 3 decades. I also feel glad to welcome Professor Sanjay Prasad, who is the current principal of Guru Nanak College, Dhanbad. I welcome Professor Amarjeet Singh, the head department of English, Professor Deepak Kumar, the controller of examination, Guru Nanak College, and also a very important faculty of the Department of English. I welcome my students, friends, and scholars from around different universities and colleges. Thanks for joining. On 24th June 2016, an initiative was taken by the IQAC of Guru Nanak College that Guru Nanak Dev lecture series be started, in which distinguished and learned scholars be invited from outside college to address our students on various themes, which can be expansive and not just part of the syllabus. It was decided to shortlist such intellectuals and to request them for sparing time and to have the lectures in the college. In the first edition of the series, we had 10 lectures on diverse topics. Since the inception of the series, it was planned that these sessions will go on with a great fanfare under the guidance of that time principal, Professor P. Shekhar. However, the current pandemic made us wait for long, and we finally decided to go virtual with the sessions of Guru Nanak Dev online lecture series, with a promise that in future we will get back to the physical mode of inviting scholars to our campus. So, ladies and gentlemen, I am glad to welcome Professor Dr. Jaydeep Sarangi as the first eminent speaker of the first installment of Guru Nanak Dev online lecture series. Now, let me tell you all about Professor Dr. Jaydeep Sarangi. I can give you a very small introduction because his area is huge and diverse. Dr. Jaydeep Sarangi is a bilingual writer, poet, critic, academician, editor, interviewer, translator, and author of a number of significant publications on Australian literature, Indian writing in English, post-colonial studies, and Dalit literary movement in India. He was a faculty of English at Seva Bharati Mahavidyalaya, Kapuguri, and Jogesh Chandra Chaudhary College, University of Calcutta. He taught at PG Department of English, Vidyasagar University. For 10 years as a guest faculty, traveled and delivered talks extensively at different universities and colleges in different parts of India and abroad. At present, he is principal, New Alipur College. He has also been acting as the president of Guild of Indian English Writers, Editors and Critics, and vice president of Intercultural Poetry and Performance Library, Kolkata. He has traveled across the globe as a resource person and writer. His books, research articles, translations, and poems are in library archives in different universities around the world, such as University of California, Sorbonne University, Harvard University, Columbia University, the British Library, London, University of Queensland, Australia, and the University of Chicago, to name a few. So, ladies and gentlemen, the topic on which Professor Sarangi is going to speak today, which he himself has chosen for today's session, is Strange Adventure to Essential Light, Current Trends in Indian English Poetry. Dr. Sarangi, the session is now all yours. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Am I audible? Varsha, hello. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You're audible, you're visible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Varsha, for introduction. First, my humble regards to the Department of English, the administration of the college, college management, the dynamic principal, sir, the president, and the faculty members of the department, and all students, distinguished scholars from different parts of India who has joined this session on Indian English poetry. Thank you all. It's really a wonderful initiative taken up by IQAC of your college, because it's our duty to impart knowledge, and knowledge sharing is the key thing for today's learning and teaching. So I cordially accept this invitation, and in return I say always there for your all attempts in near future. Okay. And today I have given the topic title, possibly you have seen, A Strange Adventure to Essential Light. Now, this is actually not my phrase. The phrase is I have taken from V.K. Gokak's Anthology of Sahitya Academy, published in 1974, where poetry writing was considered in English, poetry not in mother tongue. Poetry, think of 30, 40 years ago, when English was not a mother tongue for us, because it was mostly an alien tongue. So people thought that Indians could write prose well, Indians could write novel perhaps, because in pre-independence time, we have seen the arrival of Indian English novels so far, and also good prose. So Indians could write English poetry because the Britishers and also the very traditional stereotype categorizers, academic critics of the world, thought that poetry writing is a very specialized kind of writing which won't come for the second language users easily. Therefore, it was generally believed that poetry writing in English by the Indians were amateuristic and was a kind of strange adventure. So if you look into the pre-independence time, I won't start with much earlier days. I will just talk a little bit about the Gandhian era and when Indian English poetry, what is the scenario of Indian English poetry, to have a kind of background into my topic of discussions. The poetry of Gandhi era, by poetry I mean, always will be meaning Indian poetry in English. I don't know how long we will be using the adjective or classifier Indian in front of English poetry, because we don't use English poetry or American English poetry. So how long or Australian English poetry, we use English poetry or Australian poetry. But in Indian context, I think it's a time that we should have the liberty to break the shackles or the prison walls of the colonial interpretations of our linguistic ability. But that part I will come a little later. But the first begin with the poetry of Gandhi era. Gandhi era means during the time of Mahatma Gandhi, is suffused with intense patriotism and political awareness. It has to be, because that was the time of Indian patriotic movements and political upheavals. The stalwarts of the 20th century pre-independence Indian poetry in English, where we all know most of them were, I will say, religious minded. Swami Vivekananda, Swami Yogananda, of course, our great Rabindranath Tagore, Sri Aurobindo, Sarojini Naidu, H.N. Chattopadhyay, and we may call this age as the age of Naidu and Sri Aurobindo because of their premier role in writing poetry or engaging audience and the scholars in poetry. Love of life is the main theme of Navokishan Ghosh's poetry. Many of his poems are autobiographical. Tagore gained a place for modern India on the world literary map, not because of his English poetry, but because of his Bangla poetry. And he himself was a great translator of Bangla poetry that traveled across the globe. He was only Indian who won the Nobel Prize for Poetry. Aurobindo's poetic output is enormous, and we all know how important is Savitri, the big epic poem, which constitutes the very mind of India. And Aurobindo his works consists of lyrics, narrative poems, philosophical poems, and poetic plays. Sarojini Naidu is known as the Nightingale of India, and we all know how she occupies a unique place in the field of poetry. And she has given poetic and picturesque expression of India, and that is very important of the image building during the pre-independence time. We cannot only think that the image building is done in the sociological context or political context or the context, cultural context. Poetry is also a celebration of an image. It adds to the image construction. That's very important. And Horendranath is a very prolific writer who combines Aurobidian mysticism and Marxian experience and exploited every possible mood, pose, and stance to look at poetry from a different angle. But according to the very famous Indian English poet now, A.K. Daruwala, Indian English poetry mostly started after the Indian independence. Now, why did he say so? Because the complexity was unknown to the Indians, and mostly their pre-independence Indian English poetry was a kind of imitation of the proto-romantics or the pre-romantics or the romantic poets of Britain. And of course, the kind of complexity that nowadays we come in Indian English poetry, the depth and intensity was absent in the pre-independence period. And there was wide, ranges was wide, and but Indians could not write in English as in English poetry the philosophical concepts, the very intricate psychological aspects of mind, and so many other negotiations, appropriations, and attitudes and aptitudes, how life has been defined by so many complex waves of thoughts. But first time we come across a poet with the arrival of Nissim in the form of Nissim Ezekiel in 1952, A Time to Change. A Time to Change is not only the title of a collection, but also it changed the poetry scenario in English in India. And it came out from Fortune Place, London. And Nissim Ezekiel considered poetry as a shortcut way to discover truth. Let me read out a few lines of what he says. Poetry is an episode completed in an hour or two, but poetry is something more. It is the way, the new, and what, the flow from which a poem comes. So Nissim Ezekiel is possibly, he was also a very much important critic of Indian English poetry and Indian English writing. Therefore, he has already defined poetry in a sense, what poetry is for him. Now, in this particular context, I am reminded of the all great American or the British poets who have earned their accolade over a period of time over a chronology of time, they also have contributed as a kind of discourse behind the poetry, behind poetry. That means all have defended poetry by some kind of prose stuff. Suppose we think of kids, we have enormous letters, enormous bulks of red letters written by kids to his friends, to his brother, and to his little love, and all important letters contribute to the understanding of the mind of writing for kids. Similarly, when we talk of P.B. Shelley, we know defense of poetry, which is, I think, the Bible to know poetry and the views of poetry and how the poet comes out when it comes to practice of poetry. So when Nissim Ezekiel, an Indian, of course Indian, and when he defines how what poetry is, we have a new gharana of poetry, new angle to look at poetry. Therefore, a time to change when Nissim Ezekiel is a time to change in the real sense of the term. In my word, this is the renaissance of Indian English poetry in 1952. If we think of cricket, Indian on 25th of June in 1983, Indian winning the World Cup, which made a renaissance of cricket in India. Similarly, a time to change the time of India and change the poetry gharana of entire globe. In 1952 to 2021, we have confident nation builders in the form of poets, Indian English poets. So 70 years it took 70 years to solidify the position and the integrity, authenticity, acceptance, appropriation of Indian English poetry in the global market readers. I'll come back to it a little later, but Nissim Ezekiel's 1950 was a very important time because, of course, he started a journal, Illustrated Weekly, and The Quest, and which became an important canon-making journal for Indian English poetry. So now you have a poet, you have a journal to publish, which is a global visibility, which is pan-Indian visibility, and we need some kind of sponsorship. Establishment of Sahitya Academy in mid-1950s was instrumental in helping the regional writers, and later on also English. English also is an Indian language nowadays, which were instrumental in shaping the mind of the Indians and promoted Indian English poetry in a full form. And we needed a publisher. So we have a poet, we have a sponsorship, we have a journal to publish. Now we need a publisher who will publish Indian English poetry for the world readers. Now, you know, without the publishers, no book is visible. And don't think of a time now when you have online visibility is possible. In the then time, you cannot be visible through online. So you need a good publisher. And there came P. Lal from Kolkata. Actually, my Kolkata residence is almost stone's throw in distance from P. Lal's residence. And P. Lal's Writers' Workshop. So if you look into all major publications of Indian English poets in the first books are published by P. Lal. And P. Lal never considered publishing a novice author as a commercial suicide. He took it as a challenge. So he was very benevolent, and his contribution to look into the whole catalog, everybody, Jayanta Mahapatra, everybody published their first book through P. Lal's Writers' Workshop. So this 1950 was the time, was a kind of, which engineered Indian English poets to the maximum. And 60s and 70s were the time when Indian English scholars were invited to give talks on Indian writing, in different universities abroad. So they traveled with the baggage of their own experiences and of their own experience of poetry, their own baggage of poetry from India. And literary journals in 60s and 70s in abroad, they started accommodating Indian English poetry in a great extent. So the doors which were closed in the pre-independence period, possibly because of the lack of the variety, lack of the density, lack of confidence, lack of complexity of writing, later on it became a very straightforward, open-ended, and doors were open for publications. Now, if you look into the very early part of the Indian English poetry in 50s and 60s, another important man, of course, was A.K. Ramanujan. And to a large extent, Ramanujan's poetry is autobiographical, and it is about Hindu heritage, historical sensibility around his poetry, and he is not simply confined to Hindu faith and convictions. He is very open-minded, liberal, and he talks about rivers, talks about temples, and talks about Indian ways of life, and he is well known for the rendering of Sangam Tamil poems in English. That is very important. Always he refers to the old Tamil poets, and this deep-seated Tamil, Sangam literature is one of the important resources of his poetry. But in 1970 was very important for poetry in Indian English, because there came mostly in 50s and 60s, like Indian cricket. It was based in Mumbai. If you are a cricketer, you will have to born in Mumbai. You will have to play from Mumbai or the Western Zone, housed in Mumbai, and to become your birth to be settled in Indian cricket team. Similarly, poetry was mostly centered in and around Mumbai. But with the rise of Jayanta Mahapatra, with the arrival of 1971, the Shambhara and other poems, and 1970, the birth of Keki Daruvaras under the Orient. But Jayanta Mahapatra is the first time who actually took hold of the democratic self of India. That means poetry, Indian English poetry, was not only for the metro dwellers, metro cities. And he brought poetry from the metro centers, primarily from Mumbai and Delhi and Kolkata, to a very small forest enclosed, river enclosed town called Cuttack. According to Jayanta Mahapatra, I wanted to make sense of the life which lay in fragments before me. I was urged to seek answers of myself, testing my feelings by striking them against the fabric of a poem I know I must write. So look at the conviction already grown in Indian English poets. So what they want and how they are well equipped with the kind of English they have. Jayanta Mahapatra seeks regularity, clarity of expression, and the use of noun phrases very important. Noun phrases very important, and which frequently results in any kind of ambiguity and obscurity in his poetry, because we cannot forget the fact that he was a physicist. He was a professor of physics. And let me give you one example. In the poem Wall, all the light and those walls, the walls. Look at the use of the noun phrases, and which are setting the tempo of the poem very unique and very obscure. like any experiment in physics possibly. And here are some more examples from which stand as instances of parallelism, I think you'll say. Here lies a crumbed leaf, a filthy scarlet of power. Another example, an old fear, the wild flight, the exploding air. Very, very experimental. And like a physician, his hallmark is precision, economy of expressions, terse, and very compact. There's nothing loose in his poetry. That is very important facet that he added into poetry as force in 1970s. In 1970s, and it started in the late 1960s into 70s, one major women poet we come across who revolutionized and made new trends in poetry in the form of Kamala Das. Kamala Das, an Indian English poet, is a trendsetter who, with her poetic canons, like Summer in Kolkata, is a book no one will ever forget. The Descendants, The Old Playhouse, Tonight, This Savage Ride. Wonderful, wonderful collections, along with her semi-autobiography. I won't say biography, because autobiography, because when she wrote My Story in 1976, Kamala Das said it was her autobiography. But later on in interviews, she says, no, this is not my autobiography, this is fiction. So I'll say semi-autobiography, My Story, has fired the traditional male-oriented society and gave new dimension and new force to Indian English poetry. Her composition becomes composing of women in their search for identity. The female persona generalizes the subject and unifies women. That is quite unique. What I am able to give is only what your wife is qualified to give. We are all alike, we women, in our wrapping of hairless skin. Look at the bold usage of Kamala Das. That is which was not there before in Indian English poetry. Confession is not at all a new mode of literature, as it is the disclosure of some sort of writers have disclosed their personal feelings in a very blatant, bold, and clear manner in their works of art. The psychological documents with Christian metaphysics in St. Augustine's Confession and the uniqueness of true self in the complex psychological drama of Rousseau's famous book, The Confessions, established the impression that the confessional writing had a potent influence on the history of literature for the psychological outlets of personal feelings. And Kamala Das followed the trend set up by Sylvia Plath. I'm not going into details of that, but we must understand that Rosenthal's review, Life Studies, Kamala Das imbibed in, and that's an important book to look at the life studies, how to look at the psychological impact into the writings, and that is very important facet. 1970s and 80s, one of the very important things, Indians are now very well organized in handling psychological matters in poetry. That was not there. Actually, Indians were writing more in landscapes, the man-woman relationships, the patriarchy, the kind of role relations, and different impressions on rivers, on maybe on letters like that. But with the arrival of Vibhu Padhi, Indians got a new trend of this psychological complex mind. Mind became an important part of poetry. Vibhupada, however, maintains clarity both in tone and theme in his poetry. He truly represents Odia both as past and present and shows the spirit of Odisha, which is a guiding force of writing poetry. But the most important thing of Padhi's contribution to Indian English poetry is the psychological impact. No, he has poems on body space. He has poems on how the influence of ghosts on man's psychology, influence of the Sun Temple in the imprints of the minds of the onlookers, where the spectators or the audience have psychological imprint about the Sun Temple. He says, we exist among sounds, qualifiers, verbs. Look at two lines. We exist among nouns, qualifiers, verbs. Wonderful, wonderful way of saying our existence. We all have ontological subjectivity, theoretical preludes and epilogues and all that. But look at two powerful lines from Padhi describes our ontological living conditions. Now, another very important tradition which came into being in 1980s and 90s, the contribution from the Northeast. Indian Northeast is always neglected, because if I ask you, those who are present in today's talk, how many of you know the history of Nagaland, the history of Mizoram, the history of Assam? We know the history of Delhi. We know the history of Kolkata, partly of South India, but history within histories. So, but very prominent Indian English poets come from the Northeast, and Northeast has been represented by major English writers these days. Mamangdai is, if one person is to choose Mamangdai, and Mamangdai's poems, the mystic and the grandeur of mountains, along with myth and folklore, surround them, weave them to the ethereal story around the land and masses. Mamangdai is a celebrated writer of Arunachal Pradesh whose works are steeped in tribal folklore. A former bureaucrat, Mamangdai has the prestige of being awarded the Padma Shri for her contribution to literature. Now, this is the democratization of Indian English poetry. Now, even tribes, it has gone to the tribes, and they are really coming out with a poetry to the maximum level. Poetry that is universal. Now, during this time, we are talking about mainland India, but look at the power of Indian English poetry that traveled with Indian diaspora. There are so many big names in Indian diasporic poetry since 1980s. Meena Alexander, who died some months ago, is certainly a diasporic writer with the pangs of immigration and clash of culture within her. Her passionate involvement with the issues like immigration, race relationship is vividly articulated in her autobiographical books, Fault Lines, a memoir, Fault Lines, a memoir, 1993. The Shock of Arrival, Reflections on Post-Colonial Experience. That sense of diasporic feeling, the sense of belonging and not belonging, that is important. And her writing is always a kind of tension of adjustments, tensions of her negotiations. And she makes an emotional plea. Let me, I'm reminded of a poem she writes. My mother, brilliant mother, she knows I crawled in the pitch of your comb. Feed me with the rivers of crystal flowering. Look at the bold assertion of a diasporic Indian English poet who is speaking out in a language that is universal. Shanta Acharya, another important name, is from Odisha, settled in England. Her important books include Not This, Not That, Numbering Our Days, Illusions, Looking In, Looking Out, and many, many others. And her poetry reflects the diasporic aesthetics, which reinforces the emptiness of experiencing the exile, imposed or half imposed, in the space determined for identity. There is a beautiful poem by Shanta Acharya, Somewhere, Something, Somewhere, Something. We travel not to explore another country, but to return home refreshed, bearing gifts, rejuvenating our lives. Wonderful, wonderful way of describing the mission of the diaspora in a sense. India is a land of myths, languages, histories, cultures. Even within one state, there are many, many number of ethnic groups, languages, practices. The mosaic of poetry is varied in thoughts and expressions. The richly cultivated style and expressive elegance of Indian poets in English, after the publication of A Time to Change, marked bold English. I am reminded of Tabesh Khair. Tabesh Khair writes, distance and dollars have made the dupatta disappear. But you stay in place behind a table of rubber bands and clips. Thick mahogany it is. Thick mahogany it is. This is the English that we Indians can only write because of our background of multilingual experiences. The global, the term we always use, the global and local. The local color of the global language of Indian English poetry is a part of our socio-linguistic reality. Linguistic hybridity, will say linguistic resourcefulness, is a part of a decision maker of the decolonizing mind. It is an empowering act when we are using deliberate Indian cultural terms and expressions. We are not deviating from English. We are creating and we are empowering the act of resourcefulness. No one can determine the choice of language of the other. I strongly believe that there should not be anything as we call Indian English these days, because it's English poetry. The title of my talk is a firm assertion of the fact that Indian English poetry is English poetry. There is no point in carrying the baggage of anxiety, and if there is any anxiety, which is a past, and there is no anxiety at this point of time when the age, our generation. And Indian economy, Indian technology, Indian freedom, Indian experiments all mark the only identity of an Indian. And writing is an act of assertion of truth. And with the assertion of truth, we believe the confidence in English, the intensity and power of writing, our thoughts. We can use complex webs and layers of thoughts, the myths and consciousness, constructions. We can handle the psychology, the layers of psychology, the unsaid things, pre-speech level truths, and all like great poets of the world. We can celebrate the senses by using appropriate terms in English, by making appropriate choices in English syntax and in English stylistics. In this context, in my next part of my talk, I'm going to talk about a few very prominent, very contemporary, almost topical, is writing now, fresh, bold, in English, which is globally visible, globally sensitive, globally acceptable, and which has true colors of Indian spirit. Meena Kandasamy. Meena Kandasamy once said, the aim of poetry is to send a social message. Look at the variety of Indian English poets now. One poet, Dalit poet, is speaking out. My poetry is a social message. As a woman, that too, a Dalit woman, who gives a voice to issues such as caste oppression, discrimination, gender relations, her powerful poetry creates waves that are both celebrate as well as questioned by many in our patriarchal society. The Chennai-based poet Meena Kandasamy is political and very selective in her words, and she perfectly judges her words to the maximum, and she voices her resistance and dissent in our tumultuous social and political climate. That is brilliant. Through poetry, political dissent is being said and expressed. Akhil Katyal, professor, poet, PhD scholar, Akhil Katyal's works tend to have a political undertone to them. Politics of people, politics of relations, society, and of course governance. Katyal came to most readers' attention with the writings on Kashmir as a very contested subject many tend to avoid. Why I mention Katyal? Because now Indian English poetry has such enormous depth now. It can take up political issues, sensitive issues, issues of the border, bilateral diplomacy, and bring out the best to the world. Katyal doesn't, Katyal is a very expressive poet, and Katyal talks about LGBT rights, equality, what makes his poetry very powerful. Katyal strings together words in a manner that resonates with each other, and every reader, regardless of his stance in the subject, falls in love with Katyal. That is a major challenge for any writer from any background. Another writer we all must celebrate, possibly one of the best voices from India, is Arundhati Subramaniam. She describes herself as a poet first and foremost. That is, she writes novels, she writes fantasy prose. She is a Buddhist scholar. She has a book on Buddhism, and she writes in many spheres of life. But primarily, she categorizes, I'm a poet, a lyric poet. Arundhati Subramaniam's talents are far-reaching. An editor, curator, writer of prose, journalist of literature, performance arts, and whatnot. Her book of poems are about unbelonging and identity, love, vulnerability, uncertainty. And Arundhati Subramaniam is at her best when she writes about all these aspects and with confidently, and she teaches all sweet words and sentiments for a fabric that is rare and genius. There needs to be enough unfamiliarity to be extremely alert, but enough familiarity to be relaxed. That's truth. And Arundhati Subramaniam makes a beautiful balance of familiarity and how to make things, how to defamiliarize it, and to make the poetry look poetry, tantalizingly close, but you can't recognize it. That is. And Subramaniam is a formidable, commendable, and important figure in the world of contemporary Indian English poetry. Navanita Kanungo points the images, beautiful landscapes with her poetry, tinged by sense of longing and belonging. Her debut collection, A Map of Ruins, sing love songs for her hometown, Shillong, Meghalaya. It's a yearning to go on by, and the memories that she holds on to. There is a sense of nostalgia that prevails through this collection. But as she's shifted from Shillong to Assam, there is also a shift in the scope of subject that she is to cover. A teacher of geography in Assam, she describes the landscapes with an amazing kind of versatility and ranges of possibility. And when we read her poetry, it's a kind of catalog of things, of cultural tools before us. There's another voice from the Northeast, and we are discussing another book, another important writer, which got our attention is Vashudhara Roy. Vashudhara Roy's first book of poems, Moon in My Teacup, 2019. In the preface, Vashudhara Roy says, poetry has always been a companion, not of life's headlong activity, but of the rustle of the quieter moments when the clarity of prose is defeated, silenced, and overwhelmed by the need for figurative explorations of the experience. Her poetry is neither art for art's sake nor mere cathartic self-expression, but an intense and intimate act of transmission. A poem, she believes, is a mind teaser that blooms or wears by its ability or otherwise to communicate emotions to the reader. Reading her poems is like visiting tree roots of life charioted by vodka of uninhibited and transparent solitude of mind. Why do I mention this very particular poet? Because a second collection, Stitching a Home, published this year only, the poet says, these poems in Stitching a Home are an attempt at fostering belonging in our lives with everything and despite everything. We seldom talk about expressions like inner senses, the innate mental, inward colloquy, to poetry. We always talk about poetry is all about not too much of psychological or the kind of stream of consciousness technique that we think of. Mostly stream of consciousness we associate with novels or in prose writings. But for Vasudhara Roy, poetry of the mind is not just a Facebook status you kick and you go out. It fathoms the unfathomable dark chambers of our random thoughts, both logical and illogical. So here is another quote. I am reminded of Vibhu Padi's tradition. That is, poetry is a mental journey. Poetry is not just writing a travel diary. Poetry is not just speaking out of your impressions. Poetry is going back, meditating with the self, and coming out with a language that has its own mellifluence, that has its own call. That's why possibly we come back to John Keats again and again. We come back to Pablo Neruda again and again. We come back to Safaris. We come back to Quasimodo and all great poets, Octavia Paz, because of the intensity, the pull, the density of poetry. Each word is chosen. Each word is a minutely observed and produced words. And the words have the color of the mind. And these rare collections that I have discussed here are among the many lists of Indian English poets these days. All these poets are just the tip of the iceberg. But remember, Indian English poetry is the destination of world poetry these days. Because, of course, by Indian English poetry, I open up, it is not only written in English, but also translations from other language, other regional languages into English. Because if there is anything called heart of India, that it is the heart of translation. Now, why do I think that Indian English poetry is destination of this particular century? Because if you look into every big journal of the world, the Indian scholars, Indian poets are invited to guest edit, may it be in Australia, may it be in Kenya, or may it be in South Africa, or in Ontario, or in Latin America. Indian poetry in English is such a powerful pull and intensity that no editor can ever deny the intensity of Indian English poetry. Because the kind of linguistic background the Indians have, the kind of cultural load that Indians have, that is unique to a monocultural, monolingual country. Monolingual country. No monolingual or monocultural country can ever produce a poem like Relationship of Jayanta Mahapatra, a poem like Nanak by Vibhu Padi, because you need myth, you need legend, you need to grow up with these cultural streams. We need to grow up with these multilingual possibilities so that your mind will be so much engrossed in a culture, in a tradition, in a linguistic setup. Also, the kind of psychological density you develop, you add to it, you harness, and you produce a gem of a writing. That's why I have titled my paper, my talk today, that is Strange Adventure to Essential Light. Essential, that is important, that is prominent, visible, you cannot deny it. You cannot deny water from your life. And that is essential for the world. And light, for Indian tradition, light is very important symbol. If we read Sri Aurobindo, Power Within, or any poem by Sri Aurobindo, the symbol of light is illumination. Look at the symbol of light in Tagore's poetry, light is mind illuminated, mind like a bulb. Suddenly you flash and you give light, emit light to the world. Think of the yogic possibility of Raja Rao. Think of the serpent and the rope, the cultural conflict that we have, and look at the prosperity, look at the yogic power, energy that Vivekananda emitted to the world, that Vivekananda enlightened to the world. So Indian English poets are enlightening the world, enlightening the entire world. The enormous possibility, the enormous canvas, enormous tradition, and the kind of possibilities possible the world has never seen. The world can never even fathom it, because the unfathomable depth of Indian philosophy, Indian spirituality, Indian sociological density, cultural multiplicity, linguistic multiplicity, and all impacting on the mind, and the mind is producing the best of India, the best of the world. Therefore, Indian English poetry is destination of this particular century. I know there are so many things to say, but the class is open and now the talk is open for discussion. Anything around Indian English poetry, I'll be happy to talk to you. Over to Varsha.
Thank you so much, sir. You brought the entire scenario of what we call Indian English poetry into a capsule, and it was so captivating. Thank you very much for this. Now, I request our students, if they have any questions, to kindly drop in. I also request the eminent scholars and guests who have joined us to come with their questions if they have any, or any observation. They are most welcome. So you also mentioned a young poet, a current poet, who happens to be a very close friend of the department, Dr. Basudhara Roy Chatterjee. I am very happy that she has joined us today here on this portal.
Oh, she is here.
Yes.
Oh,
and we would like to congratulate Dr. Basudhara for her new book, which has just come out from the Red River, Stitching a Home. Congratulations, Basudhara Di, to you for bringing up such a beautiful book. We wish this book a great success and beautiful future ahead. And we hope that you keep writing such beautiful poems in future as well. So, Basudhara Di, we would be glad if you could speak a few words. As Sarangi sir mentioned, you specifically while talking about the trends of poetry. Thank you, Varsha and Jaydeep sir. Overwhelmed and happy to be with them. Thank you so much, Basudhara Di. Now the portal is open for questions. If any of the students are willing to drop in a question, please do that. Any questions?
Varsha, am I audible?
Yes, Basudhi, you are. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, I stopped a moment. I was traveling and I just stopped a moment to, I have been listening to it. It has been a wonderful session. And since we have this opportunity, we have a great scholar and critic speaking to us. It would be wonderful, if he could also, and we have a number of students on the platform. We have, we are aspiring poets ourselves. So what would be, sir's, if he had to suggest the kind of roadmap ahead for English poetry from India, as he calls it, what would be, according to him, what are the global models that we can follow, we can choose, our students can choose to further themselves in the art of poetry?
You better know, because you are one of the very important voices of India. So now one thing that is comes to my mind, that read Indian mythology. Every day, 1 hour, read Indian mythology, Indian books on Indian culture, tradition, and read poetry. Read poetry. at least 2-3 hours every day, wherever you are traveling, or suppose you are cooking, you read poetry. That a total immersion into poetry will definitely will give you an advantage. Read Neruda, read Safaris in translations, read Quasimodo in translation, read Indian English poets, those who are writing from different models, and you will take up one model. One model will sit with you. You will go with that. But reading makes a complete man. You know, by man I mean man, woman, of course. Reading only, read. If you ever visit Jayanta Mahapatra's house, you will see everywhere there are books. So you should be everything. You, who knows what will be the aspect of your poetry? You read everything. You read politics of the nation. You read world negotiations. You read sports. You read anything, and anything can trigger of your poetry. So I think for a poet, the advice is reading makes a complete poet.
Thank you, sir. How truly said. Thank you so much, Vasudradi, for that question. I hope that is very helpful for our students. We have a question by Ghanishtha. Good evening, sir. So we do call Indian poetry in English, but we do not call Indian poetry in Bangla or Kannada or Urdu, etc. Sir, how long we will take to acknowledge regional language poetry literature as mainstream poetry literature? That is the question.
The moment you will not use, that moment this will go. That means Indian poetry in English you are saying. So if you say it is English poetry, that will go. Because the colonial legacy we are following, and resistance is always there. If you are a scholar, if you are not using Indian before English poetry, your guide will mind, your teacher will mind. But I think things are falling apart. Remember, the freedom comes in mind. Freedom is not your qualification. The freedom, what you earn, and how you express it, that is freedom. And obedience is not what you and I think. Obedience is obedience to knowledge. The knowledge is, if my knowledge says my bird crow should be celebrated instead of nightingale, I will celebrate crow noises. That's why Jayanta Mahapatra has taken the poem Dawn at Puri, crow noises, endless crow noises. So mind is all important. I have started not using the term Indian before English poetry for some years. Okay, so I will advise you not to use it. Okay, drop it. How long will you continue it? Now why shall you be continuing it? There is no jurisdiction or authenticity of continuing it, because we can stand off our own feet, isn't it? And our English is acceptable, globally visible, and our English writings are read by everybody, appreciated by everybody. That's all. That is your choice.
Thank you so much, sir. Any other questions? I believe that the lecture was really, really crystal clear. So they are very sorted, and they don't have
forward. Anybody, any question?
Any questions? Please drop in. You have a couple of minutes. Please go ahead. Drop in.
Any question from Varsha?
No, sir, not really, because I have been reading you and listening to you for many years now, and you have been mentoring a lot of people like us for so many years now, since We
Are
were doing,
there research scholars here? Are there research scholars here?
I believe some. We also have Dr. Richa from Patna Women's College.
Okay.
Uh, we have Professor P. Shekhar, who himself is a
Hello.
huge literary enthusiast, who
Yes.
has been our principal for 30 years, since
Oh my God, my
1991 to
regards, regards, my regards.
2021.
Can I
He,
say something, Varsha?
please, sir, please,
Sure,
please.
sure.
Sir.
My regards.
I must congratulate you,
Oh,
Professor Jaydeep Sarangi sir. It
thank you,
has
sir.
been a very illuminating talk, I must say.
Thank you, sir.
We
Thank
were students in 1970s. You referred to that time when Jayant Mahapatra came with his poems,
you.
first time.
Hmm.
And I read one of his poems. I was initiated to that, Jayant Mahapatra,
Hmm.
in Illustrated Weekly of all places.
Oh, yeah.
That was then edited by Khushwant Singh,
Hmm.
and the poems were selected for the week by Shiv K. Kumar. He was then in Osmania University,
Hmm. Hmm.
Hyderabad.
Hmm.
So Jayant Mahapatra was introduced that way to students of English literature.
Hmm.
He remains one of the topmost poets of the century,
Wonderful.
not just in India, but I think it is globally acceptable.
Globally, globally.
You have given a wonderful talk today about
Thank
English
you.
poetry,
Thank you.
a very
Thank you.
panoramic,
Yeah,
absolutely first class.
time was short, so I took cut. So
Even then, it was
fantastic.
very well concluded,
Thank
very
you.
well done, sir.
Thank you.
I really felt delighted, and I believe I gained something through this
Thank
talk.
you. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thank you
so
so
much.
much.
Thank you so much
Thank
for coming to the tradition of Guru Nanak Dev lecture series. That is a very important dream that we started in the college,
Absolutely.
and you are part of it now. We'll preserve this lecture, and we'll talk about this later also. I have no questions, just
Thank
this.
you
Thank you.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Always there. Definitely. Always there. And for students, I think scholars, I will recommend that when we are using Indian writing in English, try to use our Indian English criticism, because our criticism is also very much wealthy and very sharp. And it's not only that you suppose you are using feminism on Indian English writing. So why will you start with British School of Feminism? You can have Sharmila Reddy, you have Uma Chakravarti, and many schools of feminisms on India. You have many books on desire, books on female body, and everything. That is so. Indian Gharana, Indian critics should be quoted more, and your thesis should be based on India, because it is an Indian topic. Indian scholars know it more well, in a better way than any foreign critic. So that is very important. Very important how you realize life, how you celebrate your own land and own people. That is important. Yeah, Varsha.
Thank you so much, sir. So we have a lot of scholars with us who are about to register for their PhDs. We also have our graduation students who are going to move into their PG courses, where they will have to write dissertations. And they find it very difficult to decide about what kind of things they can work upon, which is related to Indian English poetry.
Yeah, there are so many ways to look at Indian English poetry. Suppose many scholars can take up Northeast and their cultural negotiations. Many can take up the mapping the road of the Dalit Indian English poetry. Dalit Indian English poetry. The resistance, theme of resistance, Dalit feminism in Dalit Indian English poetry. You can think of the social resistance, political upheavals in Indian English poetry. You can think of the nationalism through Indian English poetry. And so many possibilities to look at. Comparative studies. Comparative studies very important. And psychological, suppose the way mind style in Vibhupadi's works. Or you can think of the language. That is very important aspect of the studies. Not many scholars have studied Indian English poetry through language, sociolinguistics, through sociolinguistic parameters. There are so many things one can take up. Huh? So I will encourage everyone to take up Indian subject, because that is, I may sound very nativist. We will learn everything. We'll learn Western school, Eastern school, Northern school, Southern school, but you come back to our mother for a glass of water before going to bed. Okay, so that is, more you work on Indian writing in English, more you work on Indian culture. That is very important. That is very important, and you can compare it with an Australian writer. You can compare it with a Caribbean writer. Comparative model is always welcome, but relate it to India. That is coming back to your mother for sleep at night. Yeah, isn't it?
Truly said. So thank you so much. I hope this talk helps the research scholars who are planning to take up
Anyway, journals, the canon making, journals of 1950s, 60s, archival possibilities are there. There is a good library, skill at Madurai. There's a good library in Niriyal, Gulbarga. So you can go visit and make the journals which were instrumental in shaping Indian English poetry, shaping Indian English writing. Anthologies, looking into the politics of anthologies. So many very attractive issues are there. Just jump on.
Exactly. So your area has been so diverse. You have worked with Australian poets also. You have anthologized Australian poets. You have anthologized the poets from the Northeast. You also had a book recently. A book came up which was about prose writers from the Northeast. Would you like to tell us a bit about that book, which has just come out from Sahitya Academy?
Yeah, Jai Sahitya Academy, and it is always life changes. My MPhil was on sociolinguistics. My PhD was on Indian English novel. My postdoctoral was on Indian English poetry. Another was on Australian Aboriginal writings. When I started working on Australian Aborigines, I came back from Australia and started working with the Dalits, because very important. First the outer world showed me the marginal studies, and then I came back and started working on Dalits. And while going into Dalits, I got involved into communities which are marginalized, communities which need shoulders for the critics to take up, like the Northeast. Northeastern prose. This is the first book of Northeastern prose writings. It's with Malashami Jacob. We collected prose writings from different parts of Northeast, 8 states, and which I think is an important book. Everybody is saying the first book of its kind, because you will have to grow up as a scholar. You should not only think that that I will only be applying this for the time, but you never know which is. But even then, working and all that, there is not a day in last 30 years that I have not read poetry for 2 hours. There is not a single day I have not read poetry for 2 hours in last 30 years. So there are some things you love at heart, but something always you work with the brain and the schedule. And of course, you start working and you start collaborating, and then you start, oh, that is close to your heart. And from head, it reaches to your heart. When it reaches to your heart, you feel like coming back to it again and again, isn't it? So logic becomes illogic, and then illogic governs, and you go about it. And you cannot stop unless you create it to the maximum.
Absolutely, sir. So we have a question from Dr. Richa, who is from the Patna Women's College. She writes,
Patna Women's College, I have very good memory, and I am part of its research body and all. Yeah.
Beautiful. So she has dropped a message. We have several books about history of English writing, but we have very few books on history of English literature from India. Women voices are largely missing from those books. Could you please suggest a few?
No, Richa. There are so many books. Now there are galores, books galore. So many books on Indian writing, Indian English history of English literature, Nanak, history of English literature from India, Nanak, and you'll have anger, you have, and you'll have to read so many from poetry perspective, drama perspective, from novel. You have so many, and women voices are not missing. I don't think. I think Varsha is here. If Bashudhara is here, they can also say. I think everything. We don't think that there is any dearth of material these days. The material, and there are two good libraries. Remember, where all are available. One is, you can write down. I can give you the address. That is Skillet, American College, Madurai to TN. This is the library where all Indian English literature is stored. You can be online members. They will be sending you catalogs. So for all Indian writing in English scholars, you will have to be a member of this library. And you can visit Madurai. You get an enormous library. Once you visit, you will fall in love. You will not fall in love. You will rise in love.
Wow. Thank you so much for that recommendation, sir. So my worry has been for many years now that there is a dearth of research related to Indian English poetry or poetry in general. Scholars focus on doing their PhDs or research works on fiction or non-fiction, but not many people are motivated towards research on poetry. Would you please throw some light that it is not that difficult to work on poetry, writing PhDs on poetry? It is possible to write great PhDs and great research papers and provide good critiques of poetry as well.
Yeah, Varsha, I think the problem is the other way. Now, when you think of novel and prose writings, there is not much ambiguity. And when it comes to poetry, I think poetry is very subjective. It is not objective. So some people, there is a kind of, I'll say, poetic distance between the students and the poem itself. Okay, research scholar and the poem itself. So there are not narration of everything in that way. But a novel, one can grasp different issues. It's a huge camp. His prospect is used, the length is used. One can easily understand it. But think of any poem by any poet, and it's very, or everyone will not be able to, I will say, crack the meaning of the poem. So that sensibility is not for everybody. Therefore, poetry is a very chosen kind of thing, very selective kind of thing, because the meaning is subjective. You will have to derive at a meaning through your mind, isn't it? And the possibilities. And grasping a poem is more difficult than grasping a prose, because prose is very simple, isn't it? One to one, chronologically, you can get the meaning. So this is one area where I think there is a difference. There is a difference of looking at things. But there are so many materials available, and people write more about novel because that is very comfortable. Read the novel and write a paper. Read a novel of suppose Suitable Boy, this much of novel, and read the novel and write about any character, art of characterization, you can easily write. But read 5 poems, can you come up with a poem, with a paper? Because you will have to think, you will have to refer to. So writing a paper, writing a chapter of thesis out of poetry is more challenging. It demands your gray matter to work, references to work, than to work on prose or in novel, isn't it?
Well, I agree. It has always been the most challenging task to decode those layers of poems. It's not easy. and it's not meant for everybody as well. Poems are uh, certain poems are not made for layman reading. I agree with that. So,
Mm.
yeah. However, I don't know how to make students aware on doing their research, trying to understand poems in a closer way, understand and associate with poems and poets in a closer
Therefore,
way.
for reading a poem, you'll have to live with the poem. You will have to live with the poem means you will have to take breakfast with the poem. You will have to go for bath with the poem in the mind. You will have to eat with the poem. You will come to dinner with the poem, and you will have to sleep with the poem. So complete living with the poem can give the meaning. Suppose I can refer to, I don't know whether how many of you have read the poem, but I will recommend all of you to read the poem Fall of Hyperion by Keats, isn't it? It's how perfection has been achieved. Some very uncommon, but common poems we all read. Look at Epipsychedion by Shelley. Epipsychedion is a long narrative poem of 900 lines by P.B. Shelley. And you will find how the poet develops. So only reading, and reading give you a kind of impression of what is there, isn't it? As the relationship grows with spending time together, relationship with poetry grows with spending time together.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, sir. We have a message from our respected President, Sardar R.S. Chahar, sir, who himself is a voracious reader. He reads a lot,
Mhm.
outstanding scholar. He takes out time from his very busy schedule to be with us on these platforms. So he's here with us and he has dropped a message. Wonderful coverage of Indian English poetry in pre and post independence era. Congratulations and best wishes to Sarangi sir, and thanks to Varsha for organizing and all the participants who have joined in to listen such an illuminating talk. Thank you so much, sir. Uh, it means a lot that you have joined us, uh, and now, with this, we come to the conclusion of today's session. I think it was a well brought up lecture by Professor Jaydeep Sarangi. And what our students would have read in an entire textbook comes in this one lecture. So it's a very good deal. I hope you all have made your notes properly. If not, you can check the lecture, which would be provided on YouTube as well. So thank you very much, sir, once again for
Thank you.
this.
Just one thing, if for poetry, research and poetry, if you need any material or anything, any suggestion through Varsha, you can always connect me. Because for poetry, whatever it may be, I am up there for 24 hours. I think reading poetry, talking about poetry is movement towards poetry.
Thank you so much for that, sir. I feel grateful towards our today's speaker, Professor Jaydeep Sarangi, for agreeing to do this and for bringing in so much to our table for our students, young scholars, our friends who have joined us, our seniors, our guardians of the college, our friends of from different departments. Thank you very much for joining, everybody. My sincere thanks to Professor P. Shekhar. My humble thanks to Sardar R.S. Chair, sir, for joining us. Thank you so much, Basudhara Di, for joining us. Richa, thank you for joining us. My thanks to our principal, Professor Sanjay Prasad, sir, for making me start this series again. My sincere thanks to all the teachers who have joined us today, our librarian, our students, the head of the department, Professor Amarjeet Singh, Professor Deepak Kumar, and most importantly, Professor Dr. Jaydeep Sarangi. Thank you so much, sir, for agreeing to do this. It
Thank
means
you.
a lot. We will
Thank
keep
you,
calling you
Varsha.
again and
More
again.
power to you. More power to you. Yeah, sure.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for this
Always
beautiful
there. Thank
evening.
you. Take care. All
Thank you.
everyone, write poems, love poetry. Thank you, everyone. Huh? Okay.
Thank you.
Tata.
Have a great evening ahead. Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you.